She braced for the worst. The boots in the hallway stopped outside her door. The Japanese woman, no older than 20, stared at the wooden floor of her cell in the Philippines, fists clenched, breath shallow. She had heard them whisper it. The Americans had arrived. "Cowboys," one girl spat. "They want us for one thing." The handle turned. The door creaked. And then, nothing like she expected. Instead of being dragged out, she saw a man step back and look away. An American GI, cowboy boots dusty, eyes tired but kind, gestured silently toward a basin of hot water. He had brought a towel, soap, clean clothes. "No more orders," he said gently. "Just rest." She stared at him, waiting for the cruelty. But it never came. The comfort women had expected violation. Instead, they received something more bewildering. The war was over, but the real battle, the one for dignity, memory, and truth, was only beginning. The morning they heard the trucks, many of them did not rise. Their limbs ached with fear more than fatigue, and their bodies were too used to surrender. Some remained curled on straw mats, their eyes open but unfocused, waiting for whatever vengeance the Americans had planned. The air inside the crumbling building stank of mildew, sweat, and the ghosts of men who had come and gone. For the comfort women, there had never been victory, only survival measured by silence. Now, footsteps echoed down the stone corridor, heavy, deliberate, foreign. The enemy had arrived. They expected rifles first. They expected shouts in a tongue they didn't understand, hands dragging them by their hair, punishment doled out like medicine. They expected rape. Of course they did. That's what they had been told. Americans were monsters. Americans were beasts in uniform. Their officers had spat the warnings again and again, as if repetition could prepare them for brutality. If the war was lost, they were told, at least die with your shame buried. Don't give them your tears. Don't give them your breath. So when the door opened and no one was pulled outside, only names were called, just names. It unmoored them. A sergeant stepped in, accompanied by a female medic in olive drab. She spoke in slow, careful English, then repeated the words in halting Japanese. "We are here to help. You will be taken to a camp. You will be given food, soap, clothes." Her voice wavered, not from fear, but from the impossible weight of her words. The women didn't respond. They stared. Their minds could not form a sentence. Soap? They were herded outside with gentle, non-violent gestures, but they still flinched. Some wept silently, certain the kindness was a mask. Others gripped each other's hands, ready to scream when the beatings began. But none came. The trucks were clean, lined with canvas and padded benches. The soldiers, those cowboys they had heard rumors of, didn't leer or laugh. One offered a blanket. Another handed out canteens. One woman tried to spit at a guard's boots. Her spit missed. He didn't react. As the convoy rolled through the shell of Manila, many of the women saw the bombed-out buildings of Japanese command posts they once feared. Now they were rubble. The past was ash. Every jolt in the truck rattled their bones, but more unsettling was the silence of the guards. No commands, no slaps, just the hum of engines and the murmur of voices in a language that, for the first time, did not feel like threat. When they reached the makeshift camp, ringed with wire but not despair, the first thing they were given was not food. It was soap. Heavy, off-white bars that smelled faintly of lavender. They were handed out like ration cards. The women turned them over in their hands, not knowing what to do. A medic pointed toward tents with wash basins and said, "For you." The words sounded too intimate, too undeserved. For them? Inside the washing tents, steam rose in gentle spirals. Hot water poured from spigots. Towels were stacked, clothes folded, not uniforms, clothes. One woman stood naked for 10 minutes before stepping under the stream. Her ribs jutted out like the bones of a sunken ship. She cried without sound as the dirt slid from her skin. She had not felt warm water in almost 2 years, and no one was watching her. No one waited behind her with orders or a whip. That night, the camp was quiet. The women lay on cots with clean sheets. They stared at the canvas ceiling, waiting for the screams to begin, waiting for someone to barge in and remind them they were still prisoners. But no one came. A few dared to sleep. One woman, a former schoolteacher taken from Osaka in 1942, whispered, "I am not used to blankets." Another replied, "I am not used to names." They were not numbers anymore. At roll call, an American soldier had looked her in the eye and said her name, properly. It startled her more than a slap. What they didn't yet understand was that this was not mercy. It was policy. The Americans followed Geneva rules, yes, but it was more than that. It was a calculated form of compassion, and it would be their undoing, because it didn't break the women's bodies, it cracked something deeper. The idea that they were only what they had been used for began to wither. They were still terrified, but beneath that terror a new seed had been planted. Not hope, not yet. Something stranger. Recognition. It came quietly, like the rustle of wind through a broken tent flap. No orders barked, no boots pounding in formation, just the soft rustle of blankets at night, and the rhythmic buzz of crickets outside the American wire. The comfort women, used and discarded by their own empire, now found themselves suspended in a strange purgatory. Japan had surrendered. The war was over. But no one had told them what that meant for women like them, women who had been labeled useful during the fight and shameful once the guns fell silent. They were not civilians, not quite soldiers, and the Americans weren't sure what to call them. Internment reports referred to them only vaguely. Japanese female non-combatants previously attached to auxiliary military functions. A sanitized phrase for something ugly. Comfort women didn't belong to a uniformed battalion or a post-war negotiation table. They belonged to no one, not even themselves. They slept in barracks now, clean, simple, and strangely quiet. But their minds were still loud. They were fed 3 meals a day, rice, eggs, bread, thick stews that clung to their ribs, but many could not eat without guilt twisting in their throats. They had learned to swallow pain, not warmth. And what pained them most was the absence of punishment. It made no sense. They had been told their fate would be worse than death if captured. Instead, they were handed spoons and soap and spoken to with measured English politeness. One woman asked to go to the infirmary for a toothache. She was told, "Yes, of course." She didn't sleep that night. She thought it was a trick. In truth, they were prisoners of 2 wars. One fought with bullets, and another fought with belief. And the second war was far from over. Their own country had waged it against them long before the first Americans set foot on Japanese soil. Through the code of Bushido, they had been taught to disappear. Suffering was devotion. Silence was loyalty. They were not allowed to scream when it hurt. They were not allowed to say no. Their value was measured in how well they submitted, how well they endured. No medals, no parades, no names, only obedience. And now, in a camp where no one struck them and strangers asked if they preferred tea or coffee, the question came crashing in. What if everything they had been told was a lie? The Americans didn't know what to do with them either. Not really. They fed them, gave them quarters, but they kept their distance. There was no outreach program for women who had been sexually enslaved by their own army. No protocol. At roll call, the guards called their names awkwardly, sometimes glancing away as they did. A few of the GIs were younger than the women themselves. One girl whispered after morning check-in, "He couldn't even look at me." The others didn't know whether to be insulted or relieved. That night, the silence felt heavier than the blankets. There were no more screams, no drunken officers barging in, just wind rustling through palm leaves and the occasional murmured voice in a language they were beginning to decode through rhythm, if not meaning. It wasn't silence they feared. It was what came with it, space. Space to think, to remember, to grieve. Some women cried quietly, facing the wall, biting their sleeves to muffle the sound. Others lay still with their eyes open, watching the wooden beams above their heads as if waiting for them to collapse. They didn't talk much. There were no words for this kind of in-between, no language for dignity returned in fragments. One woman, formerly stationed at a garrison hospital in the Dutch East Indies, clutched her blanket like it was a verdict. In the dim light, she whispered to no one, "If I'm not a soldier and not a woman, then what am I now?" That was the question that haunted all of them. They had survived the war, but they had yet to survive peace. The smell of stew made some of them gag. Others simply stared into their bowls, unmoving, waiting for the inevitable blow that never came. One woman whispered it first, the phrase that would ripple through the barracks like rot beneath floorboards. "They want us fat before they hurt us." And just like that, the food became a warning. Salt, meat, softness, these were not nourishment. They were traps. The Americans didn't understand the silence that greeted the trays they handed out. They thought kindness was a universal language. But for these women, raised to obey without question and suffer without end, kindness was more disorienting than cruelty. A soft bed felt like a lie. A clean shirt meant something was about to be taken. Their world had taught them to fear mercy. At mealtimes they filed into the mess tent, eyes down, shoulders tense. The food was served without fanfare, rice, potatoes, thin strips of beef. A few guards sat nearby, eating the same rations. That only deepened the unease. Why would captors share a meal? Was it pity or mockery? Some women refused to eat entirely. They tore their bread into pieces and flushed it down latrine holes. One young woman, barely 18, gagged at the taste of butter. It reminded her too much of things she once associated with childhood: her mother's kitchen, the sound of rain on the roof, safety. Now it tasted like betrayal. For others, hunger eventually overpowered pride. They ate in silence, eyes darting sideways, chewing slowly as if the food might explode. One woman sobbed uncontrollably after her first mouthful of beef stew, not from joy, but from the unbearable tension of receiving what she hadn't earned. She said later, "I didn't want to eat. I wanted to be punished. That would have made more sense." At night, wrapped in the coarse softness of American-issued blankets, the confusion only deepened. The blankets were not plush, not luxurious, but they were clean, warm. That alone made them alien. The women clutched them tightly, terrified of what comfort would cost them. Sleep came in fits. Dreams were tangled, flashbacks to rusted bed frames in brothels, the smell of cigarettes on officers' breath, the ache of being disposable. And yet, slowly, without asking permission, their bodies began to respond. They grew heavier. The sharp ridges of their ribs softened. Wounds stopped reopening. Hair began to shine again. When one woman caught her reflection in a mirror near the infirmary, she recoiled. "I look alive," she muttered. "I shouldn't." Soap had become the first rebellion. They used it with suspicion, at first only washing their hands, then their faces. Eventually, they bathed fully, scrubbing skin that hadn't known gentleness in years. Some cried as the water rinsed over their shoulders, their backs, their thighs, parts of themselves they had stopped thinking of as theirs. And the silence. The silence was a battlefield all its own. Without screaming officers, or the mechanical rhythm of servicing men, the quiet filled the spaces once occupied by orders. At first it was suffocating, then it became something else, a pause, a breath. In those silent hours between dusk and dawn, when the camp's generators hummed faintly and insects chirped outside the wire, something began to settle. Not peace, not forgiveness, just the first flicker of possibility. The indoctrination that had once lived in their bones began to erode, not from argument or ideology, but from sensation. Softness did what shouting never could. Hot stew, soap bubbles, the slow exhale of a night without violence. These were the new weapons, and they were dangerous. Because they didn't just break rules, they rewrote what it meant to exist. One morning, a woman named Yuko folded her blanket carefully and set it at the end of her cot. She smoothed its edges. When another woman asked her why, she replied, "Because it's mine." That sentence stopped the room. A claim, not of shame, but of self. The war had taken their names, their voices, their skin. Now comfort was handing them back, one sense at a time, and it terrified them, because they had been taught that softness was weakness. But what if it wasn't? What if softness was strength that the Empire had feared all along? It began with a word. "Ma'am," spoken in a low, unsure voice by a young American guard who held the door flap open for one of them as she stepped out of the infirmary. She stopped, mid-step, stunned. No one had ever called her that before, not during the war, not before it, not even when she had a name. "Ma'am," he repeated, almost apologetic. She nodded, too slowly. Her hands tightened around the blanket wrapped over her shoulders. When she returned to the barracks, she whispered the word to the others like it was a riddle. "Ma'am, respect, not assigned, not commanded, given." The Americans kept using the word, at roll call, at the food line, in passing, sometimes with a little smile, sometimes without looking at them at all. It wasn't a performance. That was what unnerved them. The GIs spoke with the same tone they used for their nurses or Red Cross women, or even each other's mothers. They didn't speak down. They didn't speak rough. It wasn't honorific. It was ordinary. That made it worse, because now the women didn't know what role to play. Some of the younger guards were barely older than the women themselves. One, Private Mitchell, had freckles and a nervous stutter. He handed out pencils one afternoon, his cheeks pink as he stumbled through a translated phrase, "You write, to home?" The camp had arranged for stationery, a bin of dull pencils and a stack of pale blue paper. The guards passed them out slowly, as if afraid of what might be written. The women sat on their cots, staring at the pages. Their hands hovered above them. Some had not held a writing instrument in years. Others didn't know what to say. What could you say, after everything? A few refused. One woman crumpled her sheet and threw it on the floor. "There's no one to write to," she said flatly. Another simply stared at the blank rectangle, then drew tiny flowers in the corner, as if afraid to place a word in the center. But some wrote, slowly, painfully. One letter began, "Mother, I am not dead." Another, "They feed us. I do not understand why." Another, "We are given soap." Not orders. The guards did not read them, at least not directly. The letters would go through official channels, censored, scanned, maybe intercepted by the Japanese. But the words on those pages were not written for delivery. They were written to be real, to exist, to say, "I was here, and I was not only what they used me for. After the letter writing, something changed. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but a stillness began to crack open. The women walked more upright. They looked at their captors longer. They began to see that the enemy had faces, not cruel, not kind, just young, just human. One evening, a woman named Emmy sat near the kitchen tent and watched a guard tuning a guitar. He was terrible at it. The notes came out sour and unsure, but he played anyway. When he glanced up, he caught her watching. Instead of turning away, he nodded. She said, "Nothing." But she didn't look down. The next morning she was called ma'am again. She did not flinch. It was a small thing. A word, a pencil, a glance. But those were the things that rewrote people from the inside. They were the things that tore holes in the fabric of ideology. Because once you were treated as a person, the question always followed, what was I before? And that question never left. It curled under their blankets at night, slipped into their soup bowls, echoed in their letters. If they were worth respect now, then the world that had stripped it from them, had ordered their silence, their submission, their disappearance, was not just cruel. It was wrong. And knowing that was its own kind of revolution. It was in the quiet, finally, that the memories came roaring back. Sleep had once been a battlefield, every blink a risk, every night another test of what their bodies could survive. But now, with full stomachs and clean beds, there was space, terrible space, for remembering. The soft clink of tin dishes in the morning, the chirp of guards, the warm steam from tea, it all became a backdrop against which the mind could finally open the doors it had locked shut. And behind those doors were girls, not soldiers, not property, just girls. Kaori had been 15. Her village in Kyushu had gathered in the town square when the recruiters came. She was told she'd be trained as a nurse, maybe sent to a base to tend to wounded soldiers. Her mother wept with pride. Kaori remembered the smell of pickled radish as they packed her small cloth bag. She wore a white ribbon in her hair that day. She never saw her village again. Yuki had been 17, working at a textile mill in Manchuria. She was offered a position serving officers in a medical station. The contract was verbal. There were no signatures. She didn't know what she was agreeing to until the doors were locked. That first week, she bit one of them, a captain, and was beaten so badly she lost 2 teeth. After that, she stopped speaking for nearly a month, and Emmy, always composed, always quiet, had never told anyone her story until now. She spoke in the dark one night, after roll call, when the barracks had settled and only the insects dared to fill the silence. "I was promised a job as a cook," she said. "They told my brother I'd be paid in gold." I still remember the way the man smiled. He had beautiful shoes. The Japanese military had made sure no one asked too many questions. Shame was a more effective weapon than a sword. Once inside, the women were stripped not just of autonomy, but of memory. They were given new names, or none. Some were forced to speak in hushed voices or risk solitary punishment. Talking about home, about family, about before, was forbidden. Their identities were threats, their histories erased. If they cried, they were weak. If they bled, they were punished. If they fought back, they were relocated to worse stations or simply disappeared. The comfort stations weren't run with chaos. They were run with precision. Every act of brutality was scheduled, reported, calculated. Their bodies were mapped like supply lines. "You are doing this for the Empire," the officers would say. "Be proud." Now, with the Americans offering stew instead of shame, the lies unraveled. Food began to stitch their bodies back together, but it also unraveled the numbness they had depended on. With every bite of real meat, every sip of soup that tasted of something other than hunger, came a wave of grief. Not for what had happened, many still couldn't name it, but for who they had once been, for the girls who braided their hair, who read poems in school, who watched the sky and wondered what came after rain. That grief was silent. It had no ceremony, no language. It showed up in the way they sat with their backs straighter now, or the way they brushed each other's hair in the mornings, in how they sometimes clutched the pencils like lifelines, writing names they had not spoken in years, names of sisters, of fathers, of the girl they used to be before they became a body, and only that. The Americans didn't see this reckoning. They saw healthier faces, fuller cheeks, quieter nights. But inside the barracks, something enormous was shifting. For the first time in years, the women were allowed to reflect. And in that reflection came mourning, not just for what had been done to them, but for what they had never been allowed to feel: loss, anger, personhood. And slowly, without permission, that mourning began to bloom into something else. A beginning, a question, a heartbeat they had once silenced returning to its rhythm. It happened by accident. Or maybe not. Maybe the guard had meant to change something, if only for himself. That evening the sun dropped low behind the trees, painting the camp in soft gold. Dinner had ended, and the women had returned to their barracks with the usual quiet shuffle of shoes over dirt. But then came a sound, low, slow, stretching like a ribbon through the stillness. A harmonica. The women froze. Some looked to the guards, thinking it must be an alarm, some strange American signal they didn't understand. But there was no rush, no shouting, no movement of weapons, just music, notes rising and falling like breath. Then, under the humming twilight, a second sound, the clumsy strum of a guitar. Off-key, hesitant, and then, yes, singing. English words none of them understood, sung in a drawl that reminded them of no country they had ever heard of. They stepped outside, one by one. Cautiously, barefoot, silent. The guards didn't stop playing. They didn't even pause. One leaned against a post, his boot tapping, mouth pressed to the harmonica like it was a prayer. Another sat cross-legged with the guitar, his fingers fumbling through a melody that was simple but aching. The tune wasn't loud, it wasn't perfect, but it was the first sound in years that wasn't meant to command, to threaten, or to punish. It was music for its own sake. To the women it was a foreign thing, not because of the language, but because of what it represented. In the comfort stations there had been noise, the grunts of men, the stomping of boots, the shouts of orders. But there had never been music, no lullabies, no festival drums. The Empire had trained them in silence. Even joy had been a kind of discipline. Their voices had been tools, not instruments. But this was something else entirely. Some sat down on crates near the barracks. Others crouched in doorways. No one spoke. They just listened. A few closed their eyes, letting the sound fill spaces inside them they didn't know were empty. And in that sound, something stirred. Fragments of memory carried on invisible threads. One woman remembered her brother tapping chopsticks on the table when he was little, pretending he was a drummer. Another remembered a summer festival in Kyoto when fireworks exploded above a lake and a boy sang from a boat. A third recalled her grandmother's voice, singing while brushing her hair. The memories were soft, dangerous, not because they hurt, but because they reminded them of who they used to be before their voices were repurposed for obedience. Then, without warning, one of the women laughed. It escaped like a gasp, high and short, and shocked by its own presence. She clapped her hand over her mouth immediately, looking around in terror. But no one stopped her. The guards didn't yell. The other women didn't scowl. Instead, one of them, Emmy, smiled. A real one, shy and crooked, as if trying on an old coat to see if it still fit. And then another laughed, and another. Not loud, not mocking, just small tentative sounds that had no place in their old world, but now found cracks in this new one. It felt like betrayal and salvation. That night they returned to their cots different, not freer, not healed, but shaken, because beauty had touched them again, and they didn't know if they were allowed to keep it. The music had said nothing, but it had spoken to them all. It said, "You are alive," and that was the most dangerous idea of all. The question arrived the next morning, carried not by a soldier, but by a woman in a pale Red Cross uniform. Or perhaps she was a chaplain. The women were not entirely sure. She had soft eyes and hands that moved carefully, as if afraid of startling anyone. She spoke through a translator, her voice calm, steady, almost ordinary, and what she asked was almost ridiculous in its simplicity. "What do you want?" For a moment no one answered, not because they were afraid of her, but because they did not recognize the language of the question. Want. The word floated in the air like a foreign object. It had no weight, no instruction, no demand, just space. They had been trained to answer only to need and command. They knew how to respond to stand, to obey, to serve. But want was something that had been stripped from them long before the war. Want had been replaced with endurance. Want had been swallowed by duty. Want had been buried with the girl they once had been. One woman finally blinked and said through the interpreter, "I don't understand." The Red Cross woman smiled softly. "Not what do you need," she clarified. "What do you hope for?" Hope. Some of them looked away. Others clenched their hands in their skirts. The silence lengthened. Not because they had nothing to say, but because saying it felt like trespassing on sacred ground. And then someone laughed nervously. "We are prisoners," she said. "Why would that matter?" The woman didn't answer. She just waited. That patience was unbearable. One by one, the words came. "I want to sew," a girl named Aiko said quietly. "Not uniforms, dresses, for children." "I want to find my brother," whispered another, her voice trembling. "They said he was sent north. I don't know if he is alive." "I want a radio," a third murmured, "to hear music whenever I want." When the translator repeated these answers, the women flinched, as if hearing their own desires spoken aloud made them dangerous. Because they were. Every one of those dreams was a betrayal of the past, a rejection of the obedience that had kept them alive. The Empire had never wanted them to want. It had wanted them to function, cleanly, quietly, without disruption. But now their wants had names, shapes, futures. The camp officers heard the requests with surprise. Some nodded politely. Others wrote notes in small ledgers. One American official even said, "We can maybe arrange sewing materials." The women stiffened. Arranged, as if desire was something that could be granted like rations. And yet, butterfly pieces of possibility began to settle. The American guards, too, began to notice a shift. The women no longer moved as one body through the mess hall. They moved as individuals. Some walked alone, some in pairs. They began to brush their hair differently, to choose different seats, to make small decisions about where they stood in line, where they stored their blankets. The numbers on their camp badges began to feel wrong, so the staff replaced them with names, actual names, written carefully on wooden tags. Not just prisoner 212, but Aiko Mori, Yumi Tanaka, Emi Shirosawa. The Red Cross woman insisted. She said it was easier for her paperwork, but the women knew it meant more. Hearing their own names called again, without mockery, without sharpness, was like hearing their heartbeat for the first time in years. Some cried, silently, others smiled, brief and unsure. But not all of them welcomed the change. For some, hope felt like betrayal, like turning their back on those who never got the chance, on the women who had died in the stations, on the girls who had walked into locked rooms and never walked out again. To want something now felt dishonest, like erasing the dead. At night, that internal war spilled out in whispers. "If we start thinking about the future," one said, "we might forget what happened." "We must not forget," another replied, "but we cannot stay buried with it." The battle between duty and desire sharpened. Their loyalty had once been absolute. Now it fractured into something far more complex. They respected the discipline they had survived under, but they also recognized the cruelty that had worn it like a uniform. And while the women wrestled with this, the Americans watched. They were not only holding prisoners anymore, they were watching people come back to life. And that, to some of the guards, was unsettling, because they had been taught the enemy was faceless. And now the enemy had names. At first, the offers felt like tricks. A job in the camp kitchen, a request for help translating, a posting near the infirmary to fold linens. These women had spent years being used, emptied out, silenced, repackaged as tools of war. So, when an officer asked Emmy if she could read Japanese and help with the mailroom, she narrowed her eyes. "Why?" she asked. "Because we need someone who can help," the translator said. "Not as a prisoner, as a worker." The word made her flinch. Worker, not prisoner, not cargo, not shame. The first few who accepted the offers did so cautiously, moving through tasks with robotic precision, expecting the moment it would all twist into punishment. But it didn't. Instead, the guards gave them space. The cook who oversaw the mess hall even showed Aiko how to sharpen a knife properly, offering her a gentle nod when she cut vegetables just right. "You're fast," he said. She blinked, unsure if it was meant as kindness. It was. These small tasks became rituals, folding napkins, mixing stew, stacking tin trays. There was dignity in labor when labor was a choice. It was not freedom, but it was participation, and in that participation came a fragile form of purpose. The Americans didn't treat them like they were reclaiming their lives, but the women knew. Each movement, self-directed, skilled, voluntary, was a piece of their identity returning from exile. Language became the next battlefield. Every evening after chores were done, some of the women gathered near the Red Cross nurse, who began teaching them basic English. "Fork," she would say, holding it up. "Spoon? Water? Please. My name is—" They repeated her slowly, syllables thick and foreign in their mouths, but they kept coming back. They wrote their names in English. They practiced greetings. They even joked, laughing as one woman said toilet instead of towel. It wasn't just language they were learning. It was voice, to speak, to ask, to mispronounce, to try. These were forbidden acts not long ago. The Empire had demanded silence from women. Now, these women were testing sound again. They whispered to each other in Japanese, of course, but they also began journaling. Pencils, once used for censored letters, became tools for something more intimate. They wrote their thoughts, their memories, their questions. No one told them to, no one graded them. They just needed to see their words on paper. One woman, Yuki, wrote the same line over and over again. "I am more than what they used me for." The idea was still raw. dangerous, but once written, it couldn't be taken back. It settled in the soul like a stone in a river, small, maybe, but immovable. Some of the guards noticed. They saw the women walking differently now, shoulders less bowed, movements less hesitant. They saw them smile at each other, saw them pick where to sit in the mess hall instead of standing where they were told. To the guards, these were minor changes, but to the women, they were seismic shifts. Because when you are used like a thing, the most revolutionary act is to decide what you are for beauty, for memory, for stories yet untold. Aiko began stitching dolls from scraps of cloth. Yuki collected fallen leaves and pressed them into pages. Emmy taught others how to write their names. These acts were not grand, but they were proof. Proof that they were not broken, not gone, not just what had happened to them. They were still here, whole, even in pieces. If you've made it this far, let us know where you're watching from. Drop a comment below, and don't forget to like the video if this story moved you. And so they wrote. At first, with hesitation, then with urgency. The camp's Red Cross nurse had begun supplying paper, claiming it helped with morale, and perhaps it did. But for these women, the act of writing became something else entirely: resistance. They poured their days into letters addressed to places that might not even exist anymore. Villages burned, streets renamed, homes lost. Still, they wrote. Dear Mother, I am alive. Dear brother, I remember your crooked smile. Dear self, do not forget what they did to you. Each word was a lifeline thrown across a chasm of silence. Most addressed their notes to family in far-off prefectures or coastal towns, some to sweethearts, others to no one in particular, just names written in hope, sealed with trembling hands. But the letters never made it home. Unbeknownst to the women, Japanese intelligence operatives working through neutral intermediaries had requested that any correspondence from known former comfort women be halted, screened, or outright destroyed. They called it a matter of national dignity. They labeled the women's presence in American camps strategic misinformation. The war had ended, but for the Empire the battle for reputation had only just begun. Families back home were told nothing. Some were quietly informed their daughters had died in service, buried in unnamed graves for honor's sake. Others were warned not to ask. A few, suspecting the truth, were shunned by neighbors, whispers following them like shadows down alleyways. Dishonor travels faster than fact. In Manila, the women waited. They waited for answers, for replies, for even a single envelope carrying a scrap of handwriting they might recognize. None came. Weeks passed, then months. The silence grew heavy, worse somehow than violence, because it said, you do not exist, not as daughters, not as victims, not as survivors. You are a mistake we are trying to erase. Some stopped writing, others grew quiet again. The kitchen work slowed, the journals thinned, the pencils dulled, but not everyone stopped. Yuki kept her letters in a small tin box beneath her cot. They were never mailed, not anymore, but she wrote them every night anyway, to her grandmother, to her past self, to the cherry trees in her neighborhood that must have bloomed without her. I stood today, she wrote once, and no one told me to sit. There was no audience for these thoughts, no expectation, just the stubbornness of existence carved into paper. For some of the women, this ritual became the last form of faith they could claim, not in gods, not in governments, but in the act of being remembered, of daring to believe that someone, somewhere, might one day read their words and say, I see you. This wasn't just grief, it was defiance, because to keep writing when the world refuses to answer, that is rebellion. because hope, when wrapped in ink and sealed in a letter that may never be opened, is still hope, because silence is not the same as absence, and invisibility is not the same as death. One evening, as the guards finished their rounds, Emmy passed a folded letter to the nurse. "No address," she whispered, "but don't throw it away." The nurse nodded. She understood. Some truths aren't meant to be sent. They're meant to be kept. And these women, these so-called comfort women, were not waiting for permission anymore. They were writing their way back into history, one stolen page at a time. And then, without warning, the trucks came. Orders for repatriation had arrived, crisp, bureaucratic, and clinical. The war was over. The camps were closing. The women would be sent home. Home. The word no longer held the shape it used to. For some, it meant rice paddies and mountain villages. For others, it was a city they hadn't seen since childhood. But for many, it meant something more uncertain. Would their families accept them? Would anyone speak their names? Would their return be seen as survival or as shame? The journey back was quiet. No flags, no celebration, just cargo holds of U.S. ships and the dull echo of waves against steel. Some women wept silently. Others clutched their tin boxes of letters, journals, sewing scraps, proof that they had lived and not just endured. They disembarked in Yokohama under gray skies. No one waited. The port officials processed them like freight. There were no questions about their well-being. Only stamps, numbers, instructions. A few were handed vouchers for train travel. Others were told to find their way. And just like that, they disappeared into the country that once used them up. What followed was not hatred. It was worse, erasure. Neighbors whispered. Employers turned them away. Families, fearing dishonor, told others that their daughters had died in the war. One woman's uncle forbade her from entering the family home. "You'll bring shame," he said. "Go somewhere no one knows you." But even in this exile, something had changed. They were not the same girls who had once been tricked, conscripted, or coerced into comfort stations. They were not the same prisoners who trembled at footsteps in the dark. In America, behind fences, they had been called by their names. They had been offered blankets, pencils, soap, dignity. And that dignity, small and fragile, had taken root. Some of them became teachers, quiet ones, tutors in country schools. Others sewed clothes for orphaned children. A few worked in hospitals, dressing wounds that reminded them of their own. They rarely spoke of the camps, or of the music, or of the cowboy who handed them a harmonica and said, "For when you feel like singing." But something inside them refused to die. The empire had wanted them for one thing, but they had become something else, human. One woman, Aiko, never married. She opened a small tailor shop in Nagano. Customers said she had kind hands. Another, Yuki, became a volunteer for the Red Cross. When asked why, she said, "Because someone once gave me paper when I had no voice." They did not organize. They did not march. Their revolution was quiet. It lived in the way they raised their children to speak kindly, in the way they treated strangers, in the way they remembered the taste of American stew and thought, not of conquest, but of mercy. Because mercy, after all, had been the real shock. The enemy had offered it, when their own nation would not. It didn't erase what had happened. Nothing ever could. But it showed them that brutality was not the only law, that a man could hold a rifle in the morning and a guitar in the evening, that a soldier could say, "Ma'am," and mean it, that people, even broken ones, could choose gentleness. And so they lived, not loudly, not always safely, but fully, with names, with memory, with the stubborn hope that their story, one day, would be believed. If this story resonated with you, please leave a comment telling us what part hit you the hardest, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this.